Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining the Innovation in Tobacco Control lecture series. I'm Kevin Welding, the Associate Director of the Institute for Global Tobacco Control here at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Angela Pratt. She has been serving as the World Health Organization representative to Vietnam since October 2022. Dr. Pratt has over 15 years experience in international public health and national health policymaking, with particular expertise in health policy, strategy, and communications, and non-communicable disease prevention and control. Before moving to the WHO Viet Nam office, Pratt was the director of the Office of the Regional Director and Director of Communications and External Affairs in WHO's Western Pacific Regional Office, based in Manila. In this role, she led development of the WHO Western Pacific Region's Communication for Health program. Angela first joined WHO in 2012 in WHO's China country office in Beijing, where she led the WHO's work in tobacco control in China for over 4 years. Previously, Angela was Chief of Staff to the former Minister for Health in her home country of Australia, during which time she was closely involved in developing Australia's world-first tobacco plain packaging laws, along with a range of other reforms to the Australian health system. Angela holds a PhD in sociology and politics from the University of Wollongong in Australia, and a master's in public health from the University of Liverpool in the UK. She's been a good colleague to the Institute for many years, and just before I hand it over to you, a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions you would like answered at the end of the talk, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your window. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Angela.
Thanks so much, Kevin, for the very kind introduction and the invitation to be here. Really delighted to be joining you all and honoured to be asked to give this lecture. So what I want to do today is really do this talk in two parts. The first part is to talk a little bit about some of the tobacco control work that I have been involved in over the last 15 or more years, as you mentioned briefly in your introduction, here in Vietnam, where I speak to you from today, in China, earlier in my WHO career, and in my home country of Australia before that. And then in part two of the lecture, towards the end, to share with you some of my personal reflections on those experiences, the most important lessons that I have learned, especially about leadership and advocacy. So to dive straight in, as Kevin mentioned, I've had a kind of what I think of as a front row seat to some really big and exciting tobacco control wins in 3 of the country contexts that I have had the privilege to work in the last 15 or 20 years. First in my home country of Australia, working on the world-leading plain packaging legislation. In China, we worked on a smoke-free law for the city of Beijing, bringing clean air to Beijing's 23 million residents. And most recently, in the last few years here in Vietnam, where we've worked on a whole range of things, but seen some 2 pretty big wins just in the last 12 or more months. First of all, Vietnam's decision to ban vaping and heated tobacco products. And secondly, a quite significant increase to tobacco taxation adopted just in May of last year. So let me start with the experience of working on plain packaging in Australia. So this policy was adopted by the Australian Parliament. The legislation was passed by the Australian Parliament in 2011. Many of you may know, but some of you don't. Australia was the first country in the world to legislate plain or standardized packaging. Both terms are used. And I think it is fair to say that this was kind of a big deal. Just in case you don't know, plain packaging or standardized packaging means the brand and the variant names are in a standard font, a standard size, a standard color. The pack is mostly covered by graphic health warnings, like the one that you can see in the picture on the screen. There is no branding, no logo, no promotional text at all. So in other words, plain packaging ends the tobacco industry's ability to use the pack as a marketing tool. In fact, it was pretty much the last marketing tool that was available to the industry in Australia, because at the time that this legislation was introduced, Australia had already banned every other form of tobacco marketing promotion. So unsurprisingly, the tobacco industry response or sort of opposition to this policy was ferocious. They ran paid advertising campaigns in the national media. They employed lobbyists. They intensely lobbied opposition parties to oppose the legislation. They launched multiple domestic and international legal challenges against the Australian government, all of which were ultimately unsuccessful. And so the policy has now been in place for a little over 15 years. The legislation, a little under 15 years, I'm sorry, the legislation came into effect in 2012. And it's had a pretty significant impact in that time. Several studies suggest that plain packaging accounts for approximately 25% of the decline in smoking prevalence in Australia that happened in the years following its implementation. Important to note that it was implemented alongside a whole range of other policies, including a quite big tax increase. And since that time, since Australia adopted the legislation, around 30 jurisdictions, other jurisdictions have now followed suit and legislated plain packaging, with, I understand, several more planning to do so in the near future. So it really was the industry's worst nightmare coming true. So just very briefly, my role in all of that. So as Kevin mentioned in the introduction, at that time, I was Chief of Staff to the Australian Health Minister, Nicola Roxon. And so my involvement in that policy, in the campaign to introduce this policy, I was responsible for negotiating the passage of the legislation through the Australian Parliament during a period of minority government, so not a straightforward passage, coordinating very closely with different partners and stakeholders on advocacy, coordinating with the bureaucracy on the details of the policy and the legislation, and of course supporting the Health Minister in everything that she needed to do to advocate for and really prosecute the arguments in favour of this really important policy. As I'll talk about a little bit more later on, the Health Minister at the time was really the most incredible public champion for this policy change, and so she required a lot of support in that role. My memories of that period, there are many. It's now quite a long time ago, but there are a few key things that really stand out when I reflect back on the experience of being involved in introducing this legislation. The first was just the ferocity of the industry campaign against the policy. We knew, of course, the tobacco industry would not like this. We knew, of course, that the tobacco industry would try to oppose this policy, but I don't think I anticipated just the magnitude of the campaign that they launched against it. They really tried to throw everything they could at trying to overturn this policy, to stop the legislation being introduced, because they feared exactly what happened, which is that if Australia successfully adopted plain packaging, many other countries would follow suit, trigger a kind of domino effect, and really narrow the space for the industry to promote and market its awful products. I also remember very clearly the intense and close coordination and work that we did with civil society organisations, other experts, partners, to advocate for the policy. And I'll come back to that a little bit later on in the session today. And then generally, I remember just having this sense at the time that what we were doing was kind of a big deal, but none of us had the time or the space or the bandwidth to really reflect on that in the moment. And it's only in the years since I left working for the government that I've had time to properly reflect on the significance of this policy, the fact that it was a world first, the scale of the fight that we had picked with the tobacco industry, and really just excited and proud to see the impact that this policy has had in the years since, and that it will continue to have, I hope, on future generations. So it was a professional experience I thought I would never be able to top. I thought it would never get better than working on a policy like this, a world-leading policy like this. But I then found myself a few years later in Beijing working for the WHO when the opportunity to push for a comprehensive smoke-free law in the city of Beijing came up. And that's the second experience that I want to share a little bit about with you today. So a few brief bits of context. All of you know that China has a huge population by virtue of the population size of the country and the very high smoking prevalence in China. It also has a very high prevalence, a high population of smokers, 300 million smokers, around 1 million of whom die every year as a result of tobacco-related illness, including 100,000 who die from secondhand smoke exposure alone. 100,000 people dying every year from secondhand smoke exposure alone. China is also home to the world's biggest tobacco company. The China National Tobacco Corporation is bigger than Philip Morris, British American, Japan, Imperial combined, I believe. It is the biggest tobacco company in the world, bar none. So doing tobacco control work in China is really very challenging, very, very challenging. So when the opportunity came up, when the Beijing city government expressed interest in the idea of adopting a smoke-free law, all of the partners who were working on tobacco control in China at that time really jumped on this. I was then working for the WHO, as I said, I was the tobacco control officer. So we worked very, very closely with all of the Bloomberg tobacco control partners, of course, national civil society organizations, other national experts, the Beijing city government, to help them to craft a robust law, a law that was 100% smoke-free. And that included some very strong and careful advocacy to make sure that there were no exemptions in the law. There were various proposals at different times, for example, to make single occupant offices exempt, to have other kinds of exemptions, in particular types of restaurants, other public spaces, but we were able to work very closely with the Beijing city authorities to make sure that the law that was eventually supported was 100% smoke-free. It was then and still is a very good law. We also worked really hard to generate public support for the policy, for example, through media and social media campaigns, to help the public understand that this was something that would actually be very good for them, that would help them. And I want to come back to this point a little bit later on in the sort of lessons learned section. One of the ways that we did this was, you can see in the picture on the screen, was to somehow convince the city authorities of Beijing and the custodians of the iconic Bird's Nest Stadium. We convinced them to drape these giant smoke-free banners around the stadium, around the iconic stadium, on the day that the law came into effect, to really create a kind of lasting visual symbol of the importance of this law, to promote the benefits of the law to Beijing's people, and also to highlight the leadership of the city of Beijing in adopting the law. So I will never forget the day that this photo was taken. You can see how happy we all are. It really was a joyful day. And this was the 1st of June 2015, the day that the law came into effect, bringing clean indoor air to 23 million people in Beijing. And the reason it was so joyful is, not just because of the magnitude of that achievement or the milestone in itself, but it was something that we really thought was unimaginable, just a year or two earlier. So an incredible thrill to be there on that particular day, as I hope you can sense from that photograph, and really just a privilege to have been involved in a little way in contributing to the success of that effort. So now to fast forward to my current role and where I sit currently as the WHO rep in Vietnam, where we've had in the last 12 months, or a little bit more than 12 months now, a couple of really exciting wins. First of all, the National Assembly's decision to ban e-cigarettes and vapes in November 2024, which was followed by a decision to significantly increase tobacco tax just last year, in May of last year. Both very significant in the Vietnam context for slightly different reasons. In the interest of time, I'm just going to focus mostly on the vapes ban, but we'll mention a couple of things about the tax work as well. So again, a few brief bits of context. Before November 2024, before this very bold policy decision was taken, Vietnam was one of the countries where vaping was completely unregulated. Vapes and heated tobacco products did not fall under any existing regulatory scope or legislation. And so the market had really exploded in the few years before 2024. What we were seeing in Vietnam was rapidly escalating rates of usage of vaping among young people and increasingly younger people, kids, people in their early teens taking up vaping. Unsurprisingly, because of that, we were also seeing increasing reports of young people being hospitalized with very serious injuries, acute lung injuries, nicotine poisoning, etc. Importantly, and this is especially important for critics of the approach of banning, there was almost no reported usage among adult smokers trying to quit. Now, there is a whole separate debate to be had about whether or not vaping can, in fact, support cessation. I have my own views on that. But in this context, that was not the case at all. No one was using vaping as a cessation tool. It was just young people hooked by the marketing, the shapes, the flavors, the colors, with really serious health consequences happening as a result. So in November 2024, the National Assembly of Vietnam took the very bold decision and brave decision to ban e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products. So to ban production, trade, importation, harboring, so possession, transportation and use of e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products. And as I mentioned, this was followed in May 2025 by a very significant increase in tax on combustible tobacco products. WHO, in my team and in my current role, we were very proud to have supported this decision. We worked very closely with the Ministry of Health and the National Assembly, first of all, to provide the evidence and advice on the harms, the health risks of vapes and heated tobacco products, the regulatory approaches taken by other countries. That's a big part of WHO's role. The countries that we work in are often interested in understanding best practice internationally, as well as to provide our advice on, the best approach in the Vietnam context. And of course, working very closely with other partners and stakeholders, including the Bloomberg tobacco control community here, we worked hard to raise public awareness about the harms of vaping, the risks, especially for young people, and the importance of very strong government action to address the problem. So again, an important public health milestone in Vietnam, one which is still a work in progress in terms of the implementation and enforcement, I would say, but based now on a very strong legal foundation. And again, something I'm very proud and feel really privileged to have played a small part in contributing to in the time that I've been in this role. So now I want to shift to part two of the lecture, which is to reflect on some of the lessons that I have learned from my experience in public health more broadly in the last 15 or 20 years, but particularly from these three examples of successful tobacco control advocacy and policy making. And I have three key lessons that I want to share with you today. So the first lesson is that communication is one of the most powerful tools that we have in public health. And this is especially important in tobacco control. And by communication, I don't just mean speaking to the media or posting things on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, though that is important too, as I'll come to in a moment. but I also mean communication which is aimed at convincing or persuading decision makers to act. And on this, I want to give a few different examples, this time in kind of reverse chronological order. So the first example relates to the picture on this slide. This is Vietnam's health minister, current health minister, Madame Da Hong Lan. She was also the minister at the time that the vaping ban was introduced. And this picture is of her in the National Assembly of Vietnam. She is holding a vape, which looks like a toy, a kid's toy. It's a little pink sort of piggy toy. And this image is now very famous in Vietnam. She was holding up the picture of an actual vape to demonstrate the way that companies were targeting young people, and therefore to make the argument about the importance of robust policy action to protect young people, to protect their health, to protect them from the risks of vaping. So the framing of the argument was all about young people, which is in itself very compelling, especially in a context like Vietnam, which places a very high value on the importance of investing in young people, investing in the next generation. Using that framing of the need to protect young people from the health risks of vaping, the minister was both very forceful and extremely credible in making the argument for the ban to the National Assembly. So combined with the very clear evidence about the harms, the framing about the importance of protecting young people, the policy became very hard to argue against. And as a result, it was adopted by the National Assembly just over 12 months ago. The second example I want to give you of communication in public health is from the Beijing Smoke-Free campaign. So I already shared the images in the earlier slides of the iconic Bird's Nest Stadium adorned with those giant smoke-free banners. That was very exciting and a very fun thing to work on, but that was something that came after the hard work of convincing policymakers to adopt the policy, to maintain the 100% smoke-free provisions in the policy, was done. Before that, and I mentioned this earlier, one of the things that we worked very hard at was building public support for the need for a law in the first place, to help give policymakers the confidence that what they were doing, that not only would they be doing the right thing for health in adopting a smoke-free law, but actually that it would be politically popular. Politicians always want to know, what will the public think about a particular policy action? And of course, they like the things that they do to be popular. And that, I think, is true of politicians in almost every country and every political system. At the time in China, though, this was challenging. I mentioned the sort of scale of the smoking problem in China, 300 million smokers, hugely high levels of exposure to secondhand smoke, a very powerful tobacco industry. So there was very little awareness and therefore very little kind of public concern about the health impacts of secondhand smoke, despite the very serious toll that was taking on Chinese society, 100,000 deaths every year. There was, however, at that time, very, very significant public concern about air pollution, the health impacts of outdoor air pollution. So we put together this infographic, which you can see shows basically compares the level of PM2.5, that's the sort of main pollutant in ambient air pollution or outdoor air pollution, comparing PM2.5 levels from air pollution compared to PM2.5 levels from secondhand smoke. And so what you can see when you look at this infographic is that secondhand smoke is way more toxic than outdoor air pollution on even the most heavily polluted day. So the picture in the middle, I think the full text has not come up on the screen, is the PM2.5 on a very heavily polluted day in Beijing, which is around 500. The level of PM2.5 in a room where, say, five or six people are smoking is something like 1,800. So this really tried to draw on people's concern about the issue of air pollution and kind of link that to try to generate some concern about the issue of secondhand smoke. I think it's fair to say that this piece of communication is the closest I have ever come to working on something that went viral. As they say in social media, it was shared millions and millions of times on Chinese social media. It was widely picked up by the national media. It made an appearance in the New York Times at one point. And so it really triggered this shift in the way the public viewed the issue of secondhand smoke and really helped to galvanize public support for the Beijing smoke-free law. So the third example that I want to give of tobacco control communications is goes back to my time in Australia working on plain packaging. And this is an example which is not about public communications. It's really an example about how to convince a political actor to take a decision in favour of public health. So the minister at the time, that is her on the left, Minister Roxon, she and her team had decided that we really did want to pursue this policy of plain packaging. An expert commission that we had set up on strengthening public and preventative health had recommended this. We knew there was very strong evidence in support of the policy. So the minister decided she really, wanted to run with it. But to be able to do that, we had to convince various stakeholders inside of the government to get on board. The finance ministry had to convince them there wouldn't be, any huge fiscal consequences of the legislation. The Foreign Affairs and Trade Ministry, knowing that this policy was likely to elicit challenges in international trade law, which it eventually did, the Attorney General's Department, and most importantly, the Prime Minister, who is the person you can see in the picture on the right of the screen. Now, most people in the government at that time, outside of the Health Ministry, were really pretty nervous about this policy, I can tell you. No country had ever done it before. We would be potentially exposing the government to legal challenges from the tobacco industry, which did happen, as I said. And because no country had done it before, were we really sure that it would be effective, et cetera, et cetera. I very, very clearly remember sitting in the Prime Minister's office the day that we went to brief him on the proposal. It was a very long discussion. We presented all of the health data, all of the studies that provided the evidence base, all of the expert advice. And he listened to all of that very carefully. But in the end, the thing that convinced him to do it was the very thing that was making everybody else nervous about it. And that was the fact that Australia would be the first country to adopt this policy. It wasn't all of the health arguments, as compelling as they were and still are. The Prime Minister loved the idea that he would be able to stand up in public, in international forums, in the national media, and say that Australia was leading the world. So the moral of that particular story, and I think the moral of some of the other examples that I have shared, is that when you're trying to convince a decision maker or decision makers, or when you're trying to engage the public on a particular issue, it's really important to know your audience. Think about who you need to convince and what will actually convince them. Maybe it's the health data, which as public health people, we all think is the most important thing, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's something unrelated to the public health data. But we all need to be better at appealing to the argument that will be most compelling for the person that we're trying to convince. Of course, the more public forms of communication are obviously also very important. And on this, my advice would be, based on some of the experience and examples that I've shared, my advice would be that clarity of message really, really matters. Do not succumb to the temptation to list off every single study, every single data point, every single statistic that supports your argument. The best way we can do justice to all of that evidence, to honour all of that science, is to pick the framing that will be most compelling to the audience that we're trying to convince. So that is my first lesson number one, which is that communication is one of the most important tools that we have in tobacco control. and we all need to use it well and use it wisely. The second example that the second lesson that I want to share with you all is about the power of partnerships and collaboration. In all of the examples of successful tobacco control work that I've been involved in, teamwork and collaboration among partners, civil society supporters, academic experts, and advocates has been absolutely instrumental to success. And that's for the obvious reason that no one person or organization can do it alone. No one person or organization has all of the knowledge, all of the skills, all of the networks, all of the access to the right decision makers, or all of the time, for example, to respond to all of the media requests. But it's when the skills, the knowledge, the network, the influence of different partners are brought together in a really strategic way that the magic really happens. This was absolutely true of the plain packaging work in Australia, and the image on the screen is of all of the some of the different advocacy groups, national, international, NGO, academic, that came together in support of this policy. Though I could show a similar slide for all of the other examples that I've mentioned today. But to sort of dwell on the Australian experience for a moment, the coordination and collaboration among different advocates really was a masterclass in coordinated strategic advocacy. Public health groups, all of the ones that you see on the screen, were very vocal in their support of the policy, which was helpful. But more helpful was the fact that they were extremely coordinated and strategic in their actions. They ran their own ad campaigns to counter the industry campaigns, commissioned opinion polling to show public support for plain packaging, produced academic research rebutting industry claims, particularly around the evidence base for this policy, and very importantly, provided well-credentialed, respectable talking heads in the media, for the media, for example. So all of that meant that in addition to the government arguing for the policy, there were many effective, credible public voices, public health voices, constantly out there in the media rebutting the industry arguments, dismantling the campaign that was being run against this policy, as well as putting pressure on the opposition parties to support the legislation in the parliament. So really, as I said, a masterclass in collaboration, in partnership, in a very strategic way. I know that the next person who will join this lecture series is Mike Daub, also from Australia. He was one of the people that was most instrumental in all of this work. Mike, if you happen to be online tonight and listening in, I just really want to give you the hugest shout out and pay tribute to you for all of your brilliant work and support during that period. As I mentioned, the importance of collaboration and the power of partnerships was also very, very true of the work on the Beijing smoke-free law. Would not have happened if it had just been WHO supporting this policy, or just any other organization, and also definitely true of the recent efforts here in Vietnam to support the e-cigarettes ban that I mentioned, the vaping ban, as well as the tobacco tax increases. So that is my lesson number 2. Think about, if you're advocating for a particular tobacco control policy, think about who your partners and your allies are. Build strong and trusting relationships with them. Spend time together strategizing. Understand each other's strengths and be intentional about leveraging them. It's really, really, really important when you work in tobacco control to remember that you are not in competition with your partners. You are in a fight against the tobacco industry together. I think sometimes we forget that, and it's really important to remember who the enemy is. And this brings me to my third lesson, which is my third and final lesson, and I'm going to wrap up in a moment, which is that if you want to be a tobacco control advocate, you really have to have the courage of your convictions. If you advocate for tobacco control policies, especially really good ones, you'll have opponents. The stronger the policy, the stronger the opposition that will come, especially from obviously the tobacco industry. Now, I am very, very fortunate to have learned this lesson from the best in the business. My then boss, the former Health Minister, the former Australian Health Minister, Nicola Roxon, someone who I'm still very proud and privileged to call a friend and a mentor today. This is one of my most favourite images of all time. It was the cover of the Australian Financial Review magazine, a big and important newspaper in Australia, who took this image and used it on the cover of its magazine at the kind of height of the plain packaging battle. Some of you, I know some of the Hopkins colleagues know Nicola, and anyone who has seen her in action knows that as the health minister, she was an absolutely formidable advocate for this policy, articulate, reasoned, rational, clear, brilliant communicator, also very tough. And her advocacy for this policy has been recognised now by many different international organisations, including WHO. During the plain packaging campaign, at the sort of height of the battle, when this image appeared on the front page of that magazine, she had been subjected to some of the most, awful attacks from the opposition, as well as the tobacco industry. Sexist, degrading, you name it, they did it or they said it, but she really never wavered for one moment. So the lesson here is that when you are pushing for strong tobacco control policies, you will have opponents, of course. Sometimes they will be within your own organization. Sometimes they'll be within your own family, especially if you have people within your family who are smokers. And if you use the media or social media to be a public voice for tobacco control policies, you will most definitely face criticism. I've seen this many times, especially during the plain packaging work. Also experienced it myself, especially in the last 12 or 18 months here in Vietnam, when I've been in the media quite a lot talking about Vietnam's ban on vaping and heated tobacco products, also posting on social media about the importance of this policy. And I've been attacked and called all kinds of horrible names. Even had the unique experience of being at a birthday party with my kids, my 5-year-old twin daughters, when the parents of some other kids came up to me and kind of laid into me about why was WHO supporting this ban on vaping, how dare I, et cetera, et cetera. Turned out these people owned a vaping sales and marketing business. So they were understandably pretty upset about the ban. The point of all of that is if you are an advocate for tobacco control, being an advocate for tobacco control is not for the faint-hearted. You really need to believe in what you're doing, and you really have to stick to your guns. But the payoffs, when you get it right and you're involved in some of the things like I've just described in the last 40 or so minutes, the rewards of that, of that effort are immense. So, Kevin, those are my three big lessons from 15 or so years working in tobacco control in a few different contexts. To recap quickly, communication, one of your most important tools, the power of partnerships, and the courage of your convictions. So I hope that these experiences and some of my own reflections have provided some food for thought for anybody who's listening online today. Maybe even some motivational encouragement for anyone who's in the thick of a big tobacco battle right now. There are times when tobacco control work is very hard. And at the moment, it feels like public health work is very hard. We live in a very turbulent world where, the value of science and evidence and public health itself seems under attack. But I just want to end by saying that at those times, I think the most important thing is to remember why we all do it, what our purpose is. And that is very simply to protect people's health and to protect people's lives. So with that, really thank you very much again for having me. It's an honor to join you and to be invited. And now very, very happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thank you for the great talk. I knew it would be great because I did get to see you do a bit of this in Vietnam. And we've got a lot of really good questions. I actually agreed to answer a lot live, so we have our work cut out for us. And I'll ask one that came in a bit later, but it sort of just touched on how you ended. And the question was sort of particularly focused at sort of the younger tobacco control professionals and sort of how we can assure that the sustainability of tobacco control can live on. So yeah, any messages you have for the younger folks in the field?
I do worry in the current climate about funding support for tobacco control internationally in particular. But on the other hand, I think the arguments in favor of it are just so clear. The return on investment in tobacco control, the lives saved, the lives improved by averting illness, death, etc., are immense. And I think while we continue collectively making those arguments, laying out that evidence, then I like to think that there are good people in the world who will continue to support that work. For the young people in particular, I think you are at the forefront of the next big battle in tobacco control, and that's vaping. I have worked in tobacco control now for a little while, as I've explained, and even still, I'm shocked every time I see the kind of parallels between what the vaping companies tell us today about vapes compared to what the tobacco industry told us about combustible tobacco 60, 70 years ago. In some places, the train has already left the station or it's pulling out from the station very fast. I feel like we're still in a window of opportunity where if we can slow it down, we can avoid another generation of people addicted to nicotine and their health impacted by all of the other toxic chemicals that are contained in many vaping products. So I guess that would be my I don't know if it's advice, but more of a plea. Let's focus on that. Of course, we shouldn't forget about or ignore the huge impact that combustible tobacco continues to have, but let's also stay really focused on the huge battle that we are in against vaping and trying to not repeat the lessons not repeat history and find ourselves in 20, 30 years saying, oh, I wish we'd, acted with a little bit more foresight and tried to stop this next wave of potential addiction in its tracks.
I'm going to try to intertwine one of my own questions with one that we received, and I think it was, you talking about your experiences in China and maybe probably a bit Vietnam as well, about keeping the tobacco industry kind of out of the government and policymakers. And that's sort of the extreme examples when it's so intertwined. And obviously we have Article 5.3 for folks who are, parties to the WHO FCTC. But obviously, progress can still be made in these places. So just if you can speak a bit about that. I know everywhere is challenging to work, but anything you can say.
Yeah, I think China is the most challenging in that the tobacco industry, as I said, I think in the talk, the China National Tobacco Corporation is the biggest tobacco company in the world, bar none, and it is owned by the government, and it sits on all of the policy committees that discuss and decide tobacco control policy. So it's not just industry influence. The industry is not knocking at the door asking for a seat at the table. The industry chairs the meeting. The industry is the table. So China is extremely challenging. That said, you do have to look for. So I don't want to in any way underplay or sort of diminish the extent of that challenge, but you have to look for opportunities. Smoke-free is very hard to argue against. Even if you accept, I think there's probably no one on this call that would, accept that smoking is okay. But even if you think smoking is okay, one person's choice to smoke should not have a negative health impact on somebody else. And that was really the framing in China for the smoke-free work a decade ago that was successful, that one person's choice to smoke shouldn't have a negative impact on somebody else to try to address the secondhand smoke issues. I do think that framing tobacco control policy around the importance of protecting young people is very important, even in somewhere like China now, where, as I said, the tobacco control policy is very hard. Many people smoke. There is greater awareness about the harms of smoking. One of the most effective lines that my former boss in Australia, Minister Roxon, used in support of the plain packaging work was she'd never met a smoker who wanted their child to become a smoker. So even if I'm a smoker and I don't want to quit, you still don't want your kid to become a smoker. So let's focus on, protecting young people. We shouldn't accept that older smokers, we should still try to help them quit, but focusing on protection of the next generation. I think that at least in the experience I've had, that can be the entry point to wedge the foot in the door to try to leverage it open to generate some small wins.
I'm going to stick with China for a second. We got one question that mentioned, pairing it with the ambient air quality was very strategic. And sometimes people hear that in a place where there is a lot of pollution, they basically say, I'm already living in some place that's so polluted. And is that an argument that you had to handle? And then, what else resonated in China? What was relevant in that context? Was it really the unpleasantness of the smoke smell, or, your clothes smelling smoky? What worked?
I think that, linking it to air pollution was, ambient air pollution. It was successful in China because it was the thing that people were focused on and cared about. And so to be able to produce one visual that showed actually the thing that you care about, which you should care about because ambient air pollution is also not good, but it's actually not doing you nearly as much harm as this other thing. Secondhand smoking is the norms around smoking, the norms around indoor smoking in China at that time were so strong that people just didn't even think to question it. And so I think the kind of success of that piece of communication was that it really changed the frame. It did engage the public in a way that they hadn't been engaged before and helped to generate public support for this policy. And as I said, politicians, no matter which political system they're in, they like to know that the policy that they want to adopt, the thing that they want to do is popular among the public. And this really did help to generate very strong sense of public support for this policy. So, it's not obviously not to say that would be the message that would work in every context. It was trying to link the advocacy to the thing that people were most focused on, or one of the things that people were most focused on in Beijing in particular at that time. So the air pollution there at that time was really, really awful. It's now much better, in part because the government was responding to that public concern and recognized the importance of taking that action. So I don't know if that totally answers the question.
I think so. I'm going to jump over to Australia. We got one question that I want to know the answer to as well. In Australia, when you're passing the plain packaging legislation, did you foresee the World Trade, or did you see the WTO argument challenge coming? And if so, how did you prepare ahead of time?
Yeah, we absolutely did. We knew that we war gamed the draft legislation very carefully with, of course, the drafters in the Health Ministry, but also the Attorney General's Department, the Ministry of Justice, it's called in some other jurisdictions, and the Foreign Affairs and Trade Ministry, in anticipation of potential challenges. And sort of had a view to, tried to war game and anticipate the angles of challenge, and then or what the bases for potential challenges would be. And I didn't do this. The drafters then tried to incorporate into the legislation sort of preemptive or anticipatory protections against those challenges. So definitely the WTO challenge was one of the ones that was envisaged. So the sort of drafting of some of the particular parts of the legislation with regard to importation, etc., were very carefully crafted. As part of the legislative process, I mean, this is the sort of standard process in Australia and in many other jurisdictions. There's a process of public consultation, which invites submissions from the public. So we really took that, sometimes that can be a little bit rushed, but we made sure there was plenty of time for those public consultations, which of course generated tons of support from the public health community, but also importantly flushed out some of the potential concerns of the industry. And so we were able to then kind of incorporate those, try to make the legislation as watertight as it possibly could be against, the legal challenges that we knew were coming. So there was a national legal challenge in the High Court. There was a challenge under an international, brought by Philip Morris under an international investment treaty between Australia and Hong Kong. There was the WTO challenge, but all of those were unsuccessful. So that the sort of strategy of wargaming and anticipating the potential lines of challenge and trying to make sure that legislation was as watertight as possible against all of those was, in the end, I think proved to be a pretty successful strategy.
So you talked about, all of the strategic messaging, knowing your audience. Could you talk a bit about any times where you had to pivot quickly and change the messaging and change your strategy, where you hit a roadblock in convincing either policymakers or the public?
I need to think about that for a moment. I think maybe to use the plain packaging example from Australia, it wasn't so much a pivot as a kind of refinement of the argument over time, if I can put it that way. I mentioned, I think, some of the nervousness about doing something that no country had ever done before. But the way the health minister framed the response to that was really very very clever, but also very simple and clear. She would just, repeatedly say, of course, there is no proof that something will work when you were the first country to do it. But here is all of the evidence. Here's all of the, studies on the role of packaging in marketing. Here's all of the sort of evidence that had been amassed by evidence. So that was one area where it wasn't so much a pivot, but that was one of the kind of different points, the lines of attack that was, most strong from the industry. Oh, you shouldn't do it because, there's no proof that it will work. And she had a very smart riposte to that argument. I think from some of the more recent examples, the Vietnam work on vaping, for example, and then tobacco tax in the last 12 months, not so much pivot as different. Sometimes the message is different for different audiences. Which is not to say there should be, of course, all of that should be consistent, but what will convince the health ministry is different to what will convince the economic ministry, for example, versus the, youth ministry and justice ministry. So targeting and tailoring the message to the audience, to whoever you need to convince, I guess would be the sort of the main reflection.
So, you talked about, and I think in general, tobacco control is a really collaborative space, but with collaboration comes coordination. How do you align communications from potentially many different partners so that you're all sort of singing the same tune, so to say?
I think a few things are important. As I said in during the talk, I think it's really important to invest in the relationships that you have with your partners, so that you have a solid foundation of trust and respect and understanding before you kind of go into battle on a particular policy. If a partnership is transactional, oh, we need to work together on this, I do this, you do that, it's never going to work very well. But sort of building, investing in those partnerships, I think is really important. when you have a strong foundation, strong foundations of trust, good relationships, you know the people that you're working with, then you can. I mean, in Vietnam, for example, with all of our partners, we developed a common messaging. Here are the key messages on taxation. Let's not make the argument that let's not highlight the argument that increasing tobacco tax will generate additional revenue. It is an argument, but actually it's not the thing that was most convincing, because the Vietnam economy is going so well that it's revenue is not actually the thing the government most needs. What was most convincing was the idea that not acting was putting at risk Vietnam's long-term national economic and social development aspirations. And again, the framing around young people, that, without increasing the barriers to entry for smoking for young people, we're really putting them at risk of a lifetime of, risk of death, disease, etc. So when you have strong relationships with your partners, you can coordinate the messaging. You can agree on what the sort of advocacy priorities are. Of course, different spokespeople then execute on those in different ways. But if there's a commonality of messaging, then that's way more important than one person, way more effective than one person saying one thing and, somebody else saying the opposite.
So some of the things I heard you say today is you do need evidence, but that's not all you need. You need to know your audience. You need great messaging. And I'll say it really helps to have a champion. You mentioned some examples of champions throughout, and I think, you probably know this. You are also a champion in your own right now. So I want to thank you for doing the work you're doing. Thanks for joining us and sharing. And thanks to everyone who tuned in. You can check out past lectures and other videos on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/global tobacco control. So thanks, everybody.